Okay, very cool. We are back with Everyday Courage. I am David Millstone.
And I'm Stephan Dweck.
And our guest today is Bob Inglis. Bob is a former GOP U.S. Congressman for South Carolina who served 2 terms and then lost his seat in a landslide to Trey Gowdy, who was a hard-right politician who rose up on the Tea Party wave during the Obama years. Bob now works full-time in climate change activism. Well, sorry, that's a terrible way of saying it, but Bob is coming to the issue of climate change from a conservative perspective rather than what everybody in my kind of blue bubble does. We're all coming at it from a more liberal point of view. Anyway, Bob says he doesn't regret his loss in that election because it was in no small part due to a principled stand on climate change. And if he had abandoned his stance to chase votes, he would not have only lacked courage, but that would have signaled to him, I'm going from what I've, a little bit of research on Bob, that he probably never would have belonged in Congress in the first place. Because as Bob put it, quote, if you're not willing to lose your seat in Congress, there's really very little reason to be there, end quote. The organization that Bob now represents is called Republican.org. And I'd love to hear you talk about that just a little bit, Bob.
Well, great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity. So Republic EN, that's EN for energy, entrepreneurship, the environment. We're conservatives who care about climate change. And so it's a thing where we believe that what we've got to do is present the message in the language of conservatism. And it's a different language than the language of the left. And the basic challenge is that the climate conversation has mostly been conducted in the language of the left. So we need to make it more accessible to right-of-center folks is the idea.
Why do you think that happened? Why do you think that the left kind of like glommed onto it and then the right was turned off?
Well, I think it's, it dates back maybe to Al Gore maybe talking about the issue and becoming so identified with it, and then a very contentious presidential race. I'm not sure that Al Gore meant to completely own the space, but it's really going to be a challenge, and it continues to be a challenge, to try to open up some space for right-of-center folks to join the conversation. But part of it has to do with just the different approaches. Dan Kahan at Yale is a guy that's got a joint appointment in psychology and law, and he says that his research shows that there are different personalities involved here, that left-of-center folks are communitarian egalitarians. They focus on the community and the whole community doing well, and they're egalitarians. They also focus on fairness. So they're communitarian egalitarians. He says right-of-center are hierarchical individualists. They believe in working through a chain of command, so they're hierarchical, and they're individualists. They believe in individual effort and reward. So if you think about it, there's a very different kinds of approaches, and the language is just completely different. So for the hierarchical individualist, the right-of-center person, it's very important to have an answer to the question, what'd you do in the war, Daddy? Whereas if you're a communitarian egalitarian, that question just doesn't occur to you because you want the whole community to succeed, and you don't need to get the gold star in the class. And so what we've got to do is speak to conservatives in their own language.
I got to...
Yeah, let's go.
No, how you doing, Bob? Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
It's good seeing you. So what I'm hearing is conservatives are okay with the message, but not okay with the presentation. The language that I'm just trying to wrap my head around. Everybody, there's a lot. Your organization is definitely concerned with climate change, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who are conservatives who share similar positions. How do we change the message? I'd like to hear examples where it could be acceptable to conservatives on a mass scale. What needs to be said differently? Because I get the liberals and conservatives want climate change, but they're hearing it differently, which turning them off. So how do we change that, and what examples can you cite?
Well, first of all, and most importantly, don't say we're all going to die next Tuesday. Because if we're all going to die next Tuesday, well, let's eat, drink, and be merry. If the apocalypse is upon us, eat, drink, and be merry. So that's the first thing to do. I mean, I've just before recording with you, I was reviewing some materials that somebody sent, and I'm thinking, boy, howdy, do the words need to change here? They had the word denialism in there. That's a trigger word. We don't use that word at republican.org because it causes people to think that you're looking down on them. You're telling them that they're stupid. You're telling them that they're like, or worse, that they're Holocaust deniers. And so we say they dispute the scientific consensus and give them the courtesy of calling them disputers, not deniers. And so, but it's what it is we think that on the right of center, there's an undeserved inferiority complex is one thing that's going on. They just think they're no good when it comes to energy and climate. And we live to tell them, no, you're the kid in class with the answer. Raise your hand.
Sorry. The question I have is, so I look at your materials on your website, and I hear you now, and I hear a guy who's coming from a version of free market conservatism that we're all familiar with through the Reagan years, and relatively familiar with through the Bush years. And then now, when many of us think of conservatism, we don't really recognize where you're coming from anymore. Well, we've been overwhelmed by this right-wing nationalism that, and then the whole, please forgive me for saying this, but for kind of the Trump cult of personality that has just scrambled all orthodoxies to the point that it feels as if people aren't really thinking through many issues, including climate change. They are simply attaching to the personality that gives them a sense of identity, the political personalities, such as a Trump.
Yeah, but the good news is that's just 35% of the GOP, according to some polling that I've seen from a pollster that I have confidence in. Only 35% of Republicans say that they're members of the MAGA movement. 61% say they're not, and then 4% are sort of like me, never Trumpers. So, but that's so we've got 61% to go for. It's the 35%, of course, are the most vocal at the moment. We hope to get some of them, but our main focus is on that 61% of non-MAGA Republicans.
So that's one. I love hearing that you're focused on that 61%. It feels as if, from out here in the bleacher seats, for those of us who aren't really involved, it feels as if the GOP leadership is really enthralled to that 30%. They seem to be following that. You said in a talk that politicians typically follow; they don't lead. And it feels as if the majority of GOP leadership is really following MAGA. What does political courage look like in this moment, when you have a majority of GOP leadership following a minority of GOP voters?
Yeah, well, what it is those are the most active and engaged people, and so those are the people that turn up to vote in primaries. Same problem exists left of center, I mean, why couldn't Kamala Harris, for example, say that, yes, we really do need to have enforcement at the border? Reason? She needed the active support of the open borders people that are way left in the Democratic Party. And so she couldn't say it. So right of center, what you have is people that feel that they can't cross Donald Trump because it'll upset that 35%. That 35% of the people that come out and vote in the primaries, or especially in runoffs. Here in South Carolina, everybody else is at the beach during the runoff time, but not those active folks.
So I'm curious, Bob, about you personally. How in these last dozen years or so, 15 years or so, have you yourself found your own capacity for courage challenged or not?
My own capacity for
courage. I'm so sorry. It's not a great. I didn't word that very well, but I look at your life and you seem to you seem to be, walked a pretty consistent road. You seem to, you know who you are, you know what you're about, you know what your values are, but has the changing landscape that we're all dealing with presented challenges to you personally?
Oh, well, in terms of the decision to, stick to the science on climate change, I don't have any regrets about that, because the data is still the data, regardless of what the moment is. And in my personal case, in terms of the election of 2010, when I got 29% of the vote in that runoff and the other guy got the other 71% of the vote, I have no regrets either, because choosing between the temporary affection of that political crowd and the lasting, appreciation of my children and grandchildren, I definitely chose the right thing. So I have no regrets about that, that's for sure. As to this moment, though, I am very concerned about where we are. This is in addition to the obvious problem that climate needs a solution quickly, and it needs to be at scale and at speed, and we believe at republican.org that free enterprise is the only way to get there at speed and scale. But meanwhile, we have this additional challenge, which is for all of us, which is the health of the republic. And I've just finished, true confession, I've only now read the Federalist Papers. So that's a
You're
true confession right here. So I did finally, however, read or really listen
It
to
took some courage, sir, to tell us that. Well done.
Exactly. So I listened to the Federalist Papers, actually, and that was a challenge, because it's 1787 language in your ears. And so anyway, what I really was impressed by is that the founding fathers really anticipated exactly this moment. They anticipated a tyrant, and they prepared for him or her. Actually, they always said him, because they always assumed it'd be a him. But they prepared for this, and they divided power into three branches, and they knew this was coming because they had a real clear understanding of the fallen nature of humankind, that we are really flawed, and that no one of us can be perfect all the time. In fact, we're quite certain that any one of us is going to screw up at some point. And so they knew that. So we're very fortunate to have that built into the systems. Yes, climate, I don't regret at all what I've done in terms of where we are as a country. I do regret where we are, and we've got to figure out a way out, a path forward.
Yeah, part of it. I'm sorry, Stephan. Part of figuring out where we are definitely is just being able to talk to each other again, and rounding back to a moment in your life that we know a little bit about, because you've talked about it a little bit. I'm really curious about that moment, though, when you were looking at that second run for Congress, and you say you had a conversation with your son, and your son said, Pop, you got to get right on climate change. So that says to me that you were open to a conversation. You're open to a conversation, possibly because this is your loved one. That's an assumption. So, what did open you? Make it possible for you to hear somebody question you in a profound way about something big that you may have had. You may have. I'm sorry, I should stop talking. I should ask you a question. Tell us
Charlie
about that
Rose.
moment. Right? Oh God.
All right, Charlie.
Sorry, man.
Yeah, well, it's like this. Love is the through line of my switcheroo on climate. I was 6 years in Congress saying climate change is nonsense. All I knew was Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina in the U.S. Congress, that was the end of the inquiry. Okay, pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was my first 6 years. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law again, and then had the opportunity to run again for the same seat in 2004. And that's what you're referencing is the year that my son, who just turned 18, was voting for the first time. And he came to me and said, Dad, I'll vote for you but you're going to clean up your act on the environment. His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. New constituency. And so, but more, it's just that, a lot of sons are trying to grow up to be like their fathers. I'm trying to grow up to be like my son. He's smart, he's fun, he's funny, he's all the things, good looking, all the things I'd like to be. And so I'm trying to grow up to be like my son. And so he had a huge impact on me, and so that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 is going to Antarctica and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings and really learning not to hate the scientist. So love continues as a through line. And then the third step was another science committee trip and really a spiritual awakening at the Great Barrier Reef, inspired by the faith of an Aussie climate scientist that I could see in his eyes and in his face, written all over his face without any words being spoken about faith. St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. So this Aussie climate scientist that I was snorkeling with, Scott Heron, was the...
So you were fortunate to have people who you really have an affinity for, really love, reach you. We're in a situation right now where we're trying to reach across, trying to communicate with people who it's very easy not to love anymore. I'm having a very difficult time in my own life keeping contact with relatives and colleagues who are MAGA. And I feel so hurt and so misunderstood by these folks that I really end up indulging an unwillingness to listen to them. How do I get past that? How do I get over that?
Well, it's hard. I can tell you that the thing that I'm spending a lot of time with is the Episcopalian. Grew up in the Episcopal Church, really came to faith in college. Spent a long time in the Presbyterian Church in America, and now back in the Episcopal Church. And there's a wonderful prayer in the prayer book. It's a prayer for our enemies. And our priest was recently pointing out that it's sort of terrible that the prayer has us asking for grace to give to these others. It doesn't have us just praying that they'd be corrected. And so it's sort of a way too well-balanced prayer in that prayer book. But it's something I'm working through. I'm right there with you, struggling with how to actually love my enemies. And I think there really are some enemies here, enemies of the Republic. We're talking people that don't want what the Founding Fathers had in mind. They want an autocracy. And I have real intense feelings about that. But I need to try to figure out how to love them and pray that they would change and come to see that, that really is a pretty stinky system that you're talking about.
I stepped on a question to Stephan had, sorry.
A couple of questions.
Yeah, sorry. That's my bad.
I got to remember the questions that I have. I don't have that problem, Bob, because I don't really have any MAGA friends. I'm good, Dave. No, but it's funny. I had a couple of questions. I got to remember. Look, you said something earlier that when you were in Congress, and this goes back to my earlier point, that you didn't believe in climate change because the messenger was Al Gore. And you just shut down like, well, it's coming from Al Gore. And it just made me think, does the left or the progressives have to change the messenger to get the word out about science? And that relates to my other question about presentation. How do we reach that 70% who voted against you in an election? Because I voted for Kamala, and I'll say this right on this podcast, one of the primary reasons was climate change. Mm-hmm. I'm a New Yorker. Trump's a New Yorker. I know him. I've lived with him for many years, being a New Yorker, and I know people know him when he was a son in Queens. So he is a climate denier. He believes that it's not real, right? So I voted against him primarily on that reason. And if your organization, I didn't know your organization existed till this podcast, which is great. You should fire your marketing person because I want to know more about it. But if I would have known that there were Republicans during the primary process who would stand up, and there were, I think, a few made some comments. I'm not exactly sure. But if somebody was taking a stance against his position, not necessarily him, but taking an opposite position to his position on climate change, it would have made me think differently about my vote. Or that there's somebody willing to convince him that we need everybody, all hands on deck, to confront this problem. This is a global issue. And that the fact that there are many people who are just shutting down because it's coming from the Democrats. I don't even want to hear what you have to say. You're condescending. You think we're stupid. We don't matter. Well, then you're not going to listen to anything I have to say. How do we get it done? And I said a lot here, but I want to address that, how I can learn more about your organization and how we can get the word about what you're doing. And two, how do we change our message to reach those 70% who voted against you?
Well, of course, getting the message out. That's why I'm on this podcast with you.
Yeah.
I hope your listeners will check us out at republicen.org. Now,
You got me. I'm listening.
Here's the thing. If a listener is an actual conservative who cares about climate change, we want them to join us. If they're not a conservative, just share the site with a friend or a family member who is a conservative, because we want to be an authentically conservative operation. So we don't want to just gin it up with a bunch of progressives that say, yeah, we
You don't want everybody. You got to check
talk
the
about
box.
this.
I got
Yeah.
you.
So, but there is a real role for your listeners in sharing us with cousin Charlie, who came to Thanksgiving last year and was disputing climate change. So Charlie needs to hear that there are others, conservatives, who care about climate change. And of course, as we were saying earlier, there's a difference between populist nationalism, which is where my party is right now, and where it really should be, in my opinion, which is a conservative party, a free enterprise party, a party that says, we really believe in the power of free enterprise. Now, it's accountable free enterprise. That's sort of an oxymoron, and it's accountable free enterprise. But what we talk about there is we just want the negative effects of burning fossil fuels to be attached to the price of products, built in. And we think that Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan's economics advisor, if he were still alive, would be very proud of that, because that's what he would say is, listen, what you got here is a problem of economics that has an environmental consequence. Fix the economics. Make it so that Inglis Industries can't dump into the trash dump of the sky for free. Because if you let me do it for free, I'll keep on dumping. Meanwhile, I got a competitor across town who doesn't dump, but her price for her product is a bit higher than mine. So I beat her every day in the marketplace because I get to dump for free all my trash. Meanwhile, she's got the better equipment. She isn't doing that, but I beat her every day. Make me accountable. And you know what? She wins then. I lose unless I can figure out a way to clean up my act. Isn't that good? And Milton Friedman would say, if he were still alive and on with us right now, he'd say exactly. That's exactly what accountable free enterprise should look like. So we think it's rock-solid conservatism that happens to be acceptable to a whole lot of people left of center, including Al Gore. I asked Al Gore if I could tell people that what we're for is the same thing he's been for about 30 years. He said, hold up, Bob. If you're talking a low, and I said, no, sir, I'm talking a substantial carbon tax that's paired with a reduction in payroll taxes so there's no growth of government, and applied at the borders to imports so that we get the world in on it. And I said, that's what we're talking about at republican.org. And he said, yeah, fine then. You can tell people what you're for at republican.org is the same thing that I've been for about 30 years. So our hope is that ultimately America can come together, because if we can bring people like Al Gore together with our kind of voice to say, hey, listen, both of us see the power of free enterprise. And by the way, Al Gore really does know a thing or two about the power of free enterprise. The man's on the board of Apple, and so he's doing fine in free enterprise.
I would like to jump, Bob, a little bit to some different language I've heard you use. I was listening to. I don't know if you know you were being taped when this was happening, but you were speaking at the Foley Institute at Cornell, and you were talking about the relationship of faith and science. My inspiration for this podcast after the election was really, I was thinking about problems of personal and collective action. How do we stir ourselves to act? I was thinking about personal agency. It occurred to me that in order to have any agency, we actually have to exercise a little bit of courage. And the only way that we actually find some real human dignity is through courage. If we don't, if we're not courageous, we end up in a way just allowing ourselves to be victims where we victimize ourselves. Anyway, you use language, the way you talk about personal agency, excuse me for putting words in your mouth, I know this is not quite right, is to talk about us as co-creators with God. So I know God's important to you, your spirituality is important to you. So, we're frequently accustomed to hearing people talk about God as the creator and as ourselves as his creation. But you are taking a slightly different tack, and that language feels really promising to me.
Well, yes, of course. I think it's a biblical truth that we are co-creators with God. It's incredible dignity that Scripture tells us we have in this role as tenders of the garden, for sure, but also really co-creators. And so it's pretty amazing dignity to the human species, really. It should give us some sense of responsibility as well.
How do we remind ourselves that we actually are co-creators with God? And how do we, in a way, take some pride in that? That, to me, it strikes me that there's real glory in accepting that responsibility to co-create with God.
Yeah, there surely is. There's a lot of responsibility and dignity in that, I guess as a father of 5 kids and a grandfather of 6 and one on the way, it seems to me it's fairly obvious that we're co-creators, but because it happens. And so we got a role in this. And we're obviously people that are here to either trash our common home or make it more beautiful. There are things you can do to make it really beautiful. That's back to why it is that some right of center people don't hear this message in a way that's compelling to them. Is they hear that it's all bad, it's all doom and gloom. What we like to say is no. This is incredible promise and opportunity. If we play our cards right, we're going to light up the world with more energy, more mobility, more freedom. It's just going to be cleaner and cheaper. We're not going to be dependent on petro-dictators. We're going to be able to say to them, see if you can drink that stuff. We just don't need you like we used to. And we're going to be breathing better. We have fewer asthma cases, fewer hospitalizations. Really, things could get a lot nicer. Co-creation, where we're co-creators with God, taking care of this place. It's not all doom and gloom. It's like, and by the way, if we play our cards right, all that innovation, we're going to make a lot of money off of it. We're going to create a lot of wealth and a lot of jobs, and it's going to be pretty cool. And so if you hear it that way, if you're right of center and you hear it that way, you say, oh, there's a role for me in the war, isn't there, Daddy? And there's something really good coming. There's a reward. There's a individual effort and reward. And so that's why we've got to speak in a different language.
So well, David, I didn't mean to step on your toes, but again, it comes back to the message. Look, if we on the other side of the political spectrum, we've got to spin it differently. For what I'm hearing from Bob, we've got to come at it from a different angle. Because this is a global issue, not a Democrat or Republican issue. We've got to, because people are not listening to us because the message is presented in a certain way. Doom and gloom, that's what I'm hearing. And if we can present it in a form of optimism and how it could actually benefit the individual, it may be internalized.
Yeah, and of course what some Democrats are working right now is this abundance message, which is a good switch. In other words, talk about energy abundance and talk about how things are going to get better. Don't just tell us we're all going to die next Tuesday and we got to repent of the capitalistic system. But another very specific thing that I would ask your listeners to think about is please don't put too much on the wagon. We're trying to pull a wagon across the finish line on climate change. And if you go loading it with all of your fondest dreams about the remaking of society as you would like to see it, that wagon is going to sink in the muck. If, for example, you want union organizing in South Carolina, and you want a higher minimum wage in South Carolina, and you want, slavery reparations. How about let's not put those on the wagon just yet. You come back later and try to convince people about those things. Right now, we need to very quickly get the climate wagon across the finish line, and I would suggest that the way to do that is by pricing in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels by a carbon tax that's paired with a reduction in payroll taxes and applied to imports. No growth of government. The world comes in on it, and then you got action. Then later, come back with those other things. You went to organize in South Carolina. Try that later.
So, Bob, how is this conversation going between you and current elected GOP leadership? You're still a Republican. You're Republican in a moment in which I'm like, dude, how can you still be a member of this party? So, you are a member of this party still. You're hanging in there. You're hanging tough. So how is this conversation going with, not so much voters, but with actual current elected representatives?
Well, when I go to Washington to see former colleagues, I guess I'm their former colleague, actually. When I go to see them, I can read the thought bubble out of their head. It's basically, great to see you, Bob. Where I really need you is back home, because that's where the action is. Most politicians follow, they don't lead, and so it's a very rare bird actually that leads in politics. You step out of line, you get shot in the back.
Are there any current politicians who do you feel are leading in an effective way or stepping out?
Yeah, for example, John Curtis in the U.S. Senate is somebody that I'm quite fond of, because he is actually leading on climate. And I was just telling him last week that he's really better at it than I ever was, because he seems to be able to bring people together. And this is a guy who represents the state of Utah. And when he was in the House, he represented Carbon County, Utah. And he got elected talking about climate. Now, in fairness to John, he tells me every time I'm with him, Bob, I'm not for your carbon tax. And I tell him, yeah, John, I know, we love you anyway. But, he's got other things that he wants to try.
It feels like, again, from the cheap seats here, it feels an awful lot like in this MAGA moment that there's a game of chicken going on between GOP elected reps and their voters. GOP elected reps want to stay in office. So a lot of them are not happy, seem to be not unhappy with Trump. But that's not what they're saying. And they are going along, and they're not standing up in the face of, using the military on American soil, or not even being able to say something when a Minnesota state senator is assassinated, is murdered. What's going on there in that game of chicken? These people. Yes, I understand that politicians need to follow, but at some point, someone has to stand up.
No, yeah, make sure. I don't think politicians just should follow. I think the job is to lead, actually.
Thank you.
But the empirical situation is they mostly follow.
Got it.
The normative, the thing we want to happen, is have them to find some courage, the point of your podcast, and risk their seat. Why not? Like you said at the outset, I'll say all the time, if you're not willing to lead, why be there? I can't imagine anything worse, than leaving Congress, realizing that you never led. When you leave Congress, or you get tossed out like I did, they actually take the plaque off the wall that was on the wall outside your office. It says, U.S. Representative Bob Inglis, South Carolina. Right. It's a big old heavy brass thing. They give it to you. Not in any kind of ceremony. It just comes in a box, It's like, so what are you going to do with it? Can you imagine getting that at your house and having had a long career in Congress and sticking it in some closet somewhere, realizing that you never led? All you did was follow. I can't imagine a worse moment. Just the most terrible moment. I join you in decrying the situation. Yeah. People need to lead in the U.S. Congress.
I would love to be a fly on the wall, and a sympathetic fly on the wall, when you're having conversations with former colleagues who you understand the predicament they're in. You understand the electoral predicament they're in. You have sympathy for them, but there's this disconnect between what they're saying publicly and what they're feeling privately. That seems to be where rubber hits the road. Perhaps among some of the colleagues and friends in your life. I just lost you.
Sorry, I went out there for just a moment. Well, yeah. I didn't hear the last part of that.
No, it's just that seems to be a place where I would imagine that in your life you would really be seeing people make the choice between being courageous and not being in some of those conversations.
Yeah, and it's pretty discouraging. But here's the thing: I think it's going to change because at some point, what we're going to realize is that political stocks rise and fall, and Donald Trump's stock was just barely enough to get him elected in 2024. That stock price is going to be dropping. And as it drops, I think what we're going to see is individual House and Senate Republicans deciding, you know what, now that the stock price is down, I think I'm going to revert to normal political policy behavior, which is taking care of the people in your district. And so if you're, if you've got offshore wind in your district, you probably want to speak out on that. If you've got electric vehicle companies in your district, you probably want to speak out, even though Donald Trump isn't. And so I think that day's coming. It's just we're early on in a second term, and then fast forward to the midterms, and at that point, Donald Trump is what you call a lame duck.
As long as we have midterms, I'm a little concerned about that. But we'll not get it. All right. So, Bob, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. I do want to, before we leave,
here we go.
Stephan hates this, but I'd love to do a quick little lightning round on a rose or thorn from, say, maybe the last week. A moment when we share a moment when we actually managed to step up in a courageous way, or we failed to do so. I like to start because it gives everybody a chance to think about this for a second. So I had a moment. I'm in a men's group, a men's therapy group. We get together on Zoom and we do our thing. And there's one member of our group at whom I've been upset for a couple of years now. I've been a bit angry at him. I've been projecting onto him a lot. I've been feeling as if he whines and he's not taking responsibility for himself. Things that I'm very aware that I do myself, of course. And I didn't say anything for a couple of years in order to preserve the good harmony of the group. I was afraid of admitting I was mad at him, and frankly, actually stopped liking him very much. But I pretended for a couple of years that I did like him, and I wasn't willing to risk this group's good opinion of me. Well, fast forward 2 years in, and as an issue comes up, and I blow my stack. I am so angry. I lose it. He and I both slammed our computers, stabbed lids down, and left the group, and I came back on 10 minutes later after I cooled down. So I managed to create the very situation in this worst possible guise that I've been trying to avoid for 2 years. So that was a real failure of courage. If I had been courageous enough 2 years ago to say, dude, this is how I'm feeling, really genuinely feeling, something much more creative and productive would have. So that's my failing. Bob, I'm going to still give you a chance to think. I'm going to go to Stephan. I love putting Stephan on the spot here.
I had the courage to listen to that. Just joking. That was long, but it was good.
Sorry, dude.
No, it's fine. I'm just joking with you. Look, on a realistic note, the courage to admit that, maybe I will think about becoming a conservative to join your organization. You make some really good points. And I think I'm about the results to try to fix this from current Category 5, now to Category 6 hurricanes in Florida, to all kind of issues we have. Everybody's affected. And so I really like the position you've taken, and I really like what you said about your organization. So I have the courage to think about looking into it more. Which I'm just not, to be open to it. And I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast who might have a different political position will be open to your message. So I think that this will help break through, certainly with me. The other thing, I had to have a conversation with a personal friend. You know, David, I have the Superman syndrome. Work out, lift, run, eat healthy, and to be vulnerable, to talk about an issue with a friend took a lot of courage for me because I didn't want to do it, but I did it. And I felt better. But it was tough for me. I know it's ego. and it's mental, but I normally don't do that. So those are my rose and thorn issues for the week.
Well done, man. Well done. Bob,
Well,
now you're on the spot, dude.
I can identify. Last week I was in D.C. and I came home breathing fire because I told my wife, spineless, whatever. I just really came in the house spitting nails about what I'd seen in Washington. A lack of courage was exactly the problem with what I was diagnosing. Michelle was asking what is my definition of courage for your show, and I think a good place to look is in Lincoln's second inaugural. So a slight modification of what he had there, which is a determination to do the right as God gives us to see the right. And so what I was doing in the thorny moment there of spitting nails when I came home from D.C., seeing a lot of spinelessness is what I was diagnosing, is I need to try to actually see it by that prayer I was talking about earlier, the prayer for our enemies. In some cases, those people I'm talking about are not my enemies, but they're people that I need to see as needing to make some progress, just like I need to. Like I said, the problem with that prayer is it's way too balanced. You wish it would sort of like pray unto those enemies, but it's if you look it up in the Book of Common Prayer, Prayer for Our Enemies, it's very balanced. It's like, teach us and them to not resort to cruelty, revenge, and something. Teach us and them, and so I was like, golly, that's really balanced. So I need to stick with that.
I really appreciate this round today. I feel I'm hearing a lot of commonalities in what we have to say.
Thank you,
about our
Bob. Thank you
challenges
for
of the
joining us.
Thank you so much, Bob. We appreciate this. If we do a season 2, we may hit you up again, man.
Well, enjoyed it. Good to be with you.
Thanks
Bye-bye,
very
guys.
much. Take care of yourself. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.